me. 2 weeks ago, I had a conversation with my guest who is also here in studio this evening, Andisa Ramavhunga, Group Chief Advisor at Ntiyiso Consulting Group. And we talked about some of the terminology that is used in business these days. Pivoting, pivoting and scaling a business and all of that wonderful stuff, right? That I have no understanding what it means. But we also talked about numbers as a language that business uses to cut through all of the non-objective stuff. Yeah? And I've got to put it out there and say that that is my weakness. Numbers just intimidate me and scare me. I hardly ever understand them. But one of the things that Andisa said once was that this is not arithmetic. It's not even maths. If you understand how to read the numbers on a balance sheet, you will understand that it is, in fact, almost like prose, if you understand it properly. It is really the identity document of your business. And I want to continue on that vein because I think it's very important for those of us who dabble in entrepreneurship and who want to grow our businesses from being small businesses into mid-sized corporations and maybe large corporations. Because I find this idea that, you're a small business owner, very disempowering. I really do. This idea that we've always got to be talking about being small all the time. Man, I don't want to stay small. No, I'm sorry. I don't want to be small all my life, right? But what that means is that we've got to become, just in our knowledge and understanding of business, the big guy with a big business. And that means that we need to understand some of the terminology. We need to understand the numbers. We need to understand the documents that go into making us understand what we're dealing with. And Andisa Ramavhunga is here with me to have that conversation about the terminology, but also about those numbers. And he joins me now. Andisa, thank you so much for joining me, sir. I really appreciate your time. Last week we had a very, very conceptual, very, very cerebral conversation around the balance sheet. I want you to go back and just break it down for us again into bite sizes, right? You and I being very, very committed to the idea that we want to help business owners out there, small and large ones, because I know that there are large ones listening to this show. I've come to know that there are some large business, owners that are listening to this particular part of the show, and it's really great because I've been receiving some feedback. But what is the balance sheet again?
No, thank you, Aubrey. I'll try slow down this time around.
Slow down.
Please keep me honest.
Break it down for us.
My challenge is because this is what we are trying to do, you and I, is to bring this to a layman's term.
Absolutely.
So that everyone
Make it relatable,
can understand. And sometimes I think we do take for granted what we know and what other people know,
sure,
and what we don't know and what other people don't know. So it's quite important that we find each other. So let me take. I'll take my message in bite chunks. I started, and it's quite important that we foreground our conversations on a conversation on numbers, because it's all about value creation, right? We started talking about how a business uses strategy to create value, and how does that become an enabler to access capital by itself. And we started introducing 3 concepts around your value proposition and the markets that you are targeting, which we call the desirability element. We then spoke about, is it feasible for you to deliver that value proposition, which was the feasibility element, which really had 3 components around the work to be done, the resourcing that you need, as well as the strategic partners.
Yeah.
And then we finally came and said, is your concept viable? And this is what we are trying to, I guess, today come to, is to have a framework that thinks about viability, that thinks about a measurement of value creation. Take it a step back. From the desirability element, value proposition, market segments, there are various components that from a financial point of view you have to think about. And this is where the the concept of revenue comes from, the pricing that you have for your products, how you charge. Is it monthly, or do you have a subscription model, or do you exchange value for goods? That's how you accrue for your revenue. On the feasibility side, there's work to be done. You need people, you need equipment to do work, you need some certain IP. You actually, even to a certain extent, the loan or the seed capital that you need is part of the resourcing on the feasibility element, so that you are able to deliver on your value proposition. And this is where the costing element is. And I said I'll take it step back, because for those who are following me, they'll start thinking, okay, revenue minus costs, it's profit. Is the financial, what we call the income statement, as one of the financial statements. But I'd like to suspend that, because I think we'll find time to come and unpack that.
Right.
Because it does, in a great deal, feed into the balance sheet. But I think I tried explaining that, and I think this is where I lost probably quite a lot of people. But for now, let's understand that this is the value that you then take back to the balance sheet, and you try to show value. So what is this value from a balance sheet point of view? I started saying that it's a very simple arithmetic. It's not mathematic. It is an equation, because you have to balance two things like a scale. But to simplify it, it's what assets does the business have? That's the value of the business, by the way. If somebody asks you, do you have a balance sheet? In essence, they're asking you if your business has assets. But the balance sheet goes further and says assets by themselves are not value, because there's two ways of funding those assets. It's either you can fund it from your own contribution, which is the equity element of the balance sheet, or you can go borrow money to fund the elements. But the money that you've borrowed, add that to the equity that you've injected yourself, are pretty much equal to the assets that you have in the business. So there's only two ways of funding the business. It's either you buy them yourselves or you borrow money. But all of them need to, when put together, equate to what we call assets. So you can view the balance sheet in essence as the assets that the business has, and how they are funded.
I said last week that, when you say to me, what is a balance sheet, it's almost like the business's ID book. Not the registration documents, but the operational side of the business's ID book. Would that be fair?
Yeah, very much. In fact, I like that analogy, except it hides a lot of things, because an ID book, I guess an ID book will tell you, it will tell you how old you are.
Yeah.
Right? And with how old you are, obviously we assume some what I call knowledge that comes, and wisdom that comes with that age. You associate different things with different people of age. But not only that, it tells you whether you are male or female, and goes further to go into your racial profile. So I like that analogy, because the balance sheet is exactly that. One, it tells you whether that business is creating value or not. In fact, I simplified it last time, but I'd like us to maybe expand on the concept. And I said the balance sheet tells you three things about the business. It tells you the operating decisions that business has made.
Yes.
It tells you the investment decisions that business has made. And more importantly, the financing decisions that business has made. So in it's a snapshot. And I know accountants or it's associated with being an annual thing, right? That you do it at the end of the financial year. But I'd like to invite entrepreneurs to say that actually a balance sheet it could be a by the hour thing, it could be a by the day thing, it could be a by a week, by monthly.
Because business is constantly dynamic, it's moving.
In fact, for our business, by the way, we're trying to manage it monthly. That's how intense we manage our balance sheet, because we want to see the value that we are creating. We'd like to look at the debt component and how we are managing it. We'd like to see how we grow the liabilities part of it. And obviously, all of it is linked to the class of assets that we have. And I'll push again to simplify it and say assets can be twofold, right? There's what we call liquid assets and those that are illiquid. And I think by definition, you'll start getting the terms of what I'm talking about. Illiquid are those assets that takes longer to turn into cash. And in fact, you asked me the other time in our last conversation, Aubrey, to say is the balance sheet equal to the cash in the bank. And I said, to a certain extent, maybe let me come and say, yeah, the balance sheet is equal to the cash in the bank. But look at it in two ways. There's liquid assets that you can turn into cash today. There's the illiquid assets that you can turn into cash in a period
time,
horizon. But ultimately, if you convert all of them to cash, that will be cash in the bank, or at least that's what it's worth. So the illiquid part of it are things like equipment, things like the buildings that we buy, even cars to a certain extent. And the liquid element or assets type of assets are things like cash that we have in a bank, receivables, because again, there's I need to be cautious there, because sometimes we have to run after them, and it could be a risk because it's money not realized.
But it could be illiquid in that sense.
It could be illiquid,
because you've got to go after that money.
Them, yes,
right,
yes,
okay,
and that's why you age your receivables
debtors,
as well, and again, without complicating the thing, this is when you'll decide whether to write off the debt or come back. But for accounting purposes, we classify them as liquid because they are due. Some of them are actually overdue to a certain extent, and it's money you should have, barring some processes that you need to take. Yeah. So receivables are liquid assets that you can liquidate very soon. Inventory, stock that or work in progress. If you are selling amagwinya, things like flowers and oil are inventory. But if you are selling amagwinya, those amagwinya that you have not sold are stock that you have in your. Those are also assets.
For as long as they're still viable.
For as long as still viable.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Give us a call, 011-883-0702. We're talking about the balance sheet. We're talking about terminology that you need to be aware of, and what it means for you and your business, and how you communicate your business to the marketplace. Yeah?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I listen to people who speak businessese. It was such a language, right? And at some point I used to think, these guys are just flexing, right? These guys are just, why can't you just use normal words?
Yeah.
But I'm beginning to get the sense that no, these words mean very specific things in the business sense.
Absolutely.
That yes, we can paraphrase them for those of us who are lay to the business world, but in business terms, they have very specific meanings that communicate very critical information to the market, to financiers, and whatever.
Yeah.
Why should the person who is a guys that fix cars, not the mechanic, the panel beater, why should he know this?
Yeah.
Why should the guy who fixes appliances, why should he know this? Why should this traditional small business guy know this stuff?
Yeah. So again, I think, Aubrey, and this is where you are much wiser than I am, because you are able to simplify these things. Your answer to that question, you actually answered it last week. That says it's a story of your business. Now it means different things to different people, and let me take it an example. And I like using this to say, when people go to the bank will ask, in a way, they always say, what are your assets and liabilities, right? But basically what they're asking is, do you have a balance sheet? But it tells them a couple of things. One, it does confirm that you have assets, and they'll ask that question probably. They say, give us your assets and liabilities, meaning your balance sheet over maybe a 3-year period, right? One thing they want to see is that, are your assets growing? So are you creating value? It answers that question. Secondly, they want to see how much of those assets are actually yours and do not belong to any other creditors. Because you can imagine, if they are there to fund this business and it has other creditors, they have very little collateral or covenants, if I may use that word. Because that's what they'll want to use as a means of lending you money, is to say, if we give you X amount, can we get assets that are worth X amount and be able to liquidate them in the event that we are not able to pay us back. But as I've mentioned, based on our earlier conversation, it also tells you the classes of assets. How liquid are your assets? How liquid are you as a person to be able to cover the loan that they are giving you? And obviously, by the way, do you have skin in the game? So it answers all those things. For an investor, by the way, or someone else, by the way, who's not a debt lender, it's very important, right? Because they also want to know, to say, if I were to invest in this business, how much of this business am I really buying, or am I buying debts? Because that's very important for an investor. But they'll also want to know how well have you been in terms of growing your balance sheet, because they are taking that gamble and they need to see whether they are making a right move or not. And they'll go on to look at the what I call capital assets. I said there's liquid and illiquid. Illiquid are typically capital assets, particularly for a capital-intensive business. That also becomes a proxy of a way to say, this is a business worthy in. It's got the capital assets to generate whatever return they want. They just want expansion capital. So there's quite a lot, by the way, you can read into a balance sheet for different stakeholders. That's why it's quite important for entrepreneurs to understand when they are creating this value, that how is it structured. And obviously there's quite a number of other decisions that I'll when we get a chance around investments and around financing that we'll talk about.
I lamented as we started our conversation this idea that I'm just a small business.
Yeah.
I lamented that. And what this conversation says to me is that this is how you start the journey of growing your business.
Yeah.
For the people that are potential financiers of your business, investors, and all of the other people that are in the market.
Yeah.
But there's no way that you can scale. There's no way that you can grow your business without having conversations with those people that have the wherewithal to invest in your business if you don't have the story of your business. And the story of your business is your balance sheet, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, Aubrey, we started with value creation, right? That story by itself is quite a powerful and compelling a story about your business journey, right? But you'll see that it quickly lags in terms of the viability element, because I think what we are talking about here is the viability element that says, are you creating that value? Is the story that you are pitching from a strategy level really believable? Because the numbers are the be it and all, because that's where they'll then put in the test to say, is this believable or not? So even when you say you are a small business, I made this statement and I'll still stick with it. There is no business that does not have a balance sheet. You probably, as a owner of that business, are not even aware. Like I said, simplistically, it says what assets do you have. Quickly, you'll realize that if you have got a very low asset base and or asset base in a sense of fixed capital, but you've got an asset base in terms of cash, that business becomes a bit unbelievable, right? Because then what you want to ask yourself is, but how are they making that money? What assets are they sweating to increase this cash on the bank? And you'll quickly distinguish between what is a pyramid scheme and what is a real business. So it's essential for entrepreneurs to understand that every business has got a balance sheet. You just need to unpack what is your balance sheet, what is the makeup of it, what type of assets do you have, how are those assets funded, whether you are funding them yourselves or they are funded by other investors. But ultimately, you need to understand the asset classes that you have in your business.
You're familiar, Andisa, with the conversation about funding, that many people who own businesses, large or small, maybe not the larger businesses, but the smaller business owners or the one-man show, the constant complaint is that nobody wants to fund me. Nobody wants to fund me. And maybe part of the question that we need to ask ourselves as smaller businesses is, how much have we invested in creating a balance sheet
yeah,
that is going to be comprehensible to a possible funder? Because I'm beginning to understand that there is no shortage of money in the world. But what there is a shortage of is the narrative that unlocks the flow of that money.
Of the money, yes.
And what I'm hearing you say is that balance sheet is at least one of the components that one needs to have in the process of unlocking that flow of revenue, right? Of money that can come into your business, with the understanding that that's how we grow our businesses. That's how we grow the value of our businesses.
Yeah.
Because if I'm unable to service my clients, my customers, because I just have a serious cash flow problem, but I don't have a balance sheet that I can go to a bank or to a venture capitalist to say, listen, I need money on the basis of this truth. There's no way I'm going to get that money, right?
Yeah. So, and it's quite important again and I don't want to give a lecture of which funding do you get when, but I'll just give a high level, at least appreciation. Again, I still refer to that Papaji conversation you had, I think 4 weeks ago, where he said banks will give people with money. So if you have got cash in your bank account, so banks are likely to fund you, which is true. Remember, I said cash is an asset class, and it's sitting in your balance sheet, because banks would like to see that if they fund you money. Remember, with them, they're not taking risk on the business. They want guaranteed cash flow or streams of income. So for them, it's more important around what type of assets that are quickly liquid that they can then use to then advance you the loan, because it's a measure, again, not to say that it's a full picture, but it gives them a sense of whether you'll be able to pay them back or not. So it's important if you are going to go to the debt financing institutions to think about your balance sheet, because they'll only back that horse that at least has got a solid balance sheet. That means there's assets, quite a great deal that's illiquid and so forth. But for a venture capitalist, it's a different class of funding that you want. Remember, I did say that those guys are the ones that typically take the risk on often unproven concepts, and often unproven in terms of scaling. And again, they'll buy into that story that we've spoke about. Those guys will be more interested to say, do you have a clear value proposition? Do you have a clear market segments that you're going to? Have you thought about the feasibility of it? Have you costed these things? They'll more likely buy that story. And with them as well is to take that risk to try create that equity component of the balance sheet. And typically they because they all, again, take a portion of the business in terms of ownership. So the amount of money they give you is not immediately due. So it allows you to use that cash and even pen it, and you can go for the round of, if you've had those, particularly in Silicon Valley, to say there's rounds of funding trying to capitalize the business. That's where they are trying to look at the equity portion of the business. But once that business has reached a certain level and it's starting to scale, that's when you then now move into the debt lenders, where now they look at the balance sheet. They look at, for example, you're not yet earning income, but you've used that equity to fund some assets. Those assets could be IP. It could be a new innovation you've been developing. You could have been testing out the concepts as well, right? So you are realizing some cash. So you're starting to have quite a solid story that then becomes attractive to debt lenders. Right. So that cycle is also important to believe, or at least to appreciate. But it all starts with all these concepts we spoke. So there's no way you're going to go to venture capitalists without understanding. Or debt lenders, without understanding your value creation, which is the strategy, or the balance sheet as a source, and other financial statements, and we'll get into them as a source of value creation.
I want to invite you, as you listen to this conversation, and ask you a very simple question. If you've got a business, whatever the size of the business is, have you got a balance sheet? And if you don't have a balance sheet, why not? Is it because you are at the place where you don't believe you may need to go to a bank, to a venture capitalist, or to a debt lender of whatever form to reinvest in your business to make it bigger, to make a bigger impact? I'd be interested to hear from you. 011-883-0702. My guest is Andisa Ramavhunga. He's Group Chief Advisor at Ntiyiso Consulting Group. We're talking about numbers. We're talking about balance sheet. We're talking about Yeah, about some of those terminologies that are used in business. Why is it that you don't have a balance?
Entrepreneurship
on 702.
Andisa Ramavhunga, Group Chief Advisor at Ntiyiso Consulting Group, is my guest. We're talking about the balance sheet. And I asked you just before the break, why don't you have a balance sheet? Many of us, when Andisa started our businesses from a very subsistence place, survivalist place. We didn't necessarily start our businesses because we wanted to scale and grow. We didn't do business for business's sake. We did business for survival's sake. And so some of these ideas that you and I are talking about now belong to a world that many of us are not familiar with. A world that says, oh, so people give you money if you give them information? Yeah? People give you money if you give them information? That's really the relationship between the balance sheet and the market, isn't it?
Yeah. No, absolutely, Aubrey. So I guess this is what we are trying to create with this series of conversations. How do we bridge that gap between what people would term a survivalist a market to bridging those companies, bringing them in the mainstream of the economy? Because the mainstream of the economy is exactly that, Aubrey. It's information. You can appreciate now, even with the advent of the internet and information technology and communication, people who typically make these decisions around investing or lending debt are not people who live in our neighborhoods, right? Are not people who know even our own environments and circumstances. And the only basis that they can make those decisions is a basis of information and how well you narrate that story. And that's why it's important that you narrate a story of the organization itself, the decisions that they made, and I said there's 3 types of them, and how that impacts on the balance sheet, because this is all to do with value creation. And without again going back to the American story, but I think I love this analogy because it's so powerful. The story of Uber that says it's the biggest taxi operator without owning the taxi. You can imagine if you were to look at the Uber's balance sheet, you would not see vehicles there.
Yeah.
Or you'd even ask yourself if, for example, let's assume for now we lived in the Stone Age, where we were not aware of these things. Because the next question is, how are you creating so much money without having taxes? And yet you say you were in the taxi
I want to tell you a story.
Yeah.
On that's based on a call that I had yesterday. A very, very sad call. From one of my listeners, a guy by the name of Justice, who is an Uber driver. And he tells the story of the fact that Uber is a multi-billion rand organization that uses them and doesn't need them. And how that is being played out. We've got lots of calls. Can I take these calls and then maybe we can go into that. But let's go into the call. Tebogo is in Benoni. Good evening to you, Tebogo.
Hi,
yeah, good, very good. Thanks, Debza.
Yeah. First, I want to talk about the balance sheet as well, but from a perspective of a service provider. You know, one of the difficulties of funding businesses, especially small businesses, is with regard to producing like a very powerful balance sheet. But if you are a service provider, take a typical example of maybe a painter or an electrician. You will understand that you don't really need much equipment to be running. You just need your knowledge or your background. But in terms of physical assets, because remember now, let's say you're an electrician but you're staying at home. You go to the bank or whatever finance that is going to be funding you. You're going to produce your home or your house as a business-related activity. Or if you're a painter, you're going to say this house is related. Because in the balance sheet, you need to include assets to the extent that they relate to the business itself. But if something is not or is non-business related, you cannot really prove that this physical asset that I own relates to the business. At the same time, when you go to the bank, they will want you to prove what assets you own. You will find that if you are a painter, the only asset that you really need to do your job effectively is maybe a brush and something. But in the rest, the paint and everything is being supplied by whoever you provide the service to. So I think that's where the challenge comes in. So that's where, in my view, I think an income statement is more reliable for certain businesses.
Sure.
But then you'll find that the funders will always ask for the balance sheet. So I think balance sheet only applies to the extent that the business itself, to function, it needs a whole lot of equipment. Pretty much like when you're running something like selling food, where you will need physical equipment like stoves and everything. So I don't know what it gets to you on that.
I hear you, Tebogo. Let me take the next call, but I'm interested to find out from you, Andisa, as to whether that is entirely true. Is it possible to enter the fact that I'm working from home into the balance sheet such that it makes sense to the person that is wanting to understand a little bit more about the operations of my business? Or is Debza on the money by saying that you can only really include things in the balance sheet that are directly relatable to the business, not just about the fact that you're using that place as your abode, but you're also using it for your business? I want to hear your thoughts about that, because I imagine that whoever is looking at your balance sheet wants to know what are the things that you are using to get that competitive advantage, and perhaps working from home is that competitive advantage. And the question then becomes, how do you make that entry into the balance sheet? But let's take a call from Andrew in Randburg. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, good evening, everybody. How you guys doing?
Very good, thanks, Andrew. Go ahead, man.
No, thank you. I own a small assigned services business. It's been a family entity that I sort of inherited after COVID. And I managed to grow it quite well. But I must say, I've been financing it quite a bit on my end. And after a good 14 months or 15 months, I've finally able to get asset finance, which is actually quite difficult to get for a new entity. That's what they call it these days, the banks. But I must say, being an entrepreneur, you have to fight for every inch of every ground. And I just want to give some advice to all the entrepreneurs.
Sure.
Fight hard, work hard, if you're doing it. And anything's possible. Just hang in there, and there will be light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, I went to the banks, applied for vehicle asset finance, and then they all declined me, and then they came up with some nonsense, and then I complained to one of the banks on their social media, and then all of a sudden doors opened. So fight for it, guys. That's what you got to do.
Andrew in Randburg, thanks very much. You can't run away from that sober counsel, I tell you right now. Let me speak to Piri in Alex. Good evening to you, Piri.
Good evening, bro.
Yeah, go for it, man.
Just very quick question from my end. I mean, when I have two sets of balance sheets, how do I determine which one is a good balance sheet and which one is a bad one? And also, for a business such as a sports club, what would normally go into the balance sheet as say the assets of that particular kind of a business? Thank you.
Piri in Alex, much appreciated. Andisa?
Yeah, I think let's take the first question, the question around, I guess the gentleman was talking more about standing surety for the business. That's why they would go for his own personal assets. But that simply says that the business, as an entity or as a named individual, does not have a strong balance sheet. That's why they'll often look at the owners and want the owners to stand surety, because maybe the owners by themselves have got strong enough balance sheet as people, because you've got a house, you've got a car, and they obviously want to know the exposures and all those to factor it into a funding decisions or not. But I'm not a bank, so I guess bankers would be out there. I disagree with the notion that says an income statement is more important than a balance sheet, because there's quite a lot, and it depends again on what type of a business you are. There's quite a lot that's hidden in the income statement. For example, the income statement does not tell you the true cash flow of the business. Because, and let me give you a typical example. There's some revenue that you get, but you can't count it as cash because, right? There's certain expenses that you incur, but you have not paid as yet. Those are called prepaid, is it postpaid, expenses, right? Because you've incurred them, but you have not paid for them. That one might make your income statement look quite healthy, but your cash flow not so healthy, right? And that's why he's introducing another element now that says, let's look at the cash flow statement, but let me suspend that. But why I prefer the balance sheet? Because the balance sheet will show you all that view, right? It will show you how much of your assets are held in cash and how much of your assets are held in receivables, as I've said, people who are yet to pay you money. But also in the balance sheet, there's ways of recognizing what is a prepaid expense as well as in terms of a liability, right? Because you still have to pay it, and that will show you whether you are creating value or not. And for me, that's why the balance sheet becomes the panacea of value creation. So that's my and he spoke about the painter, but he raised a very good. Another stakeholder, by the way, would want to look at your financials, and that would be your potential client, right? You can imagine if you are to contract with large entities, and I like this painting example, right? Because can you imagine today if you were to contract for painting services with one of the huge property operators who are operating malls across the country and so forth? What would they want to see as an indicator that you are able to deliver on the work? It's simply the balance sheet, because they will want to see how big your assets are. Your assets could be cash, by the way. Does this guy have money to buy paint, right? Because we're only going to pay him once is painted the thing. So right. A balance sheet becomes a good indicator to someone who's going to buy. And more often than not, you see it a lot in government procurement, where they would want to see a set of financials. But typically what they are trying to assess is the size of your business, whether you'll be able to deliver on what they require, because their purchasing requirements are much bigger, and they can't take a chance on a small guy, and not because they don't want to take that chance, but because financially or resource wise it could be constraining, or it could be risky to take a chance on the small guy. The second caller, absolutely, I think we have to be there, and one of the topics we've spoken about being relentless, and we spoke, and this is where now you start innovating on your business model, right? Around do you buy an asset or do you rent it? And as I've mentioned, there's three decisions, right? I said it's operating decisions, it's investment decisions, it's financing decisions. The investment decisions and the financing are in a way related, although I'm simplifying it, because the investment decision says you're buying a capital asset. Right. The financing decision says, are you gonna get equity to buy that, or are you gonna get debt lending? And so forth. Look, it could be, in a sense, financing decisions as well. When you pay out dividends, you count them under there. But the operating decisions, that's where you make strategic decisions, right? You mentioned vehicle and asset finance. Is it to just bootstrap the idea? Is it maybe more feasible to rent a vehicle or purchase one? And again, if you rent it out, it's not realized in your balance sheet because it's an expense. And I did say, if we get an opportunity, we'll unpack the income statement. So it might not, you might be operating a vehicle business, but nothing is showing in your balance sheet. So I cannot divorce value creation, the concepts we spoke, desirability, feasibility, viability, from the scoreboard, right? I did say finances are the scoreboard, because whatever decisions you make from a business model, they then, you would see them in practice in the in your finances, and I'm saying particularly the balance sheet. I did say Uber is the biggest taxi operator, and yet in the balance sheet there are no taxes, by the way. So those are our business model decisions that you make around operating decisions that have got an impact in how the scoreboard looks like. The last caller spoke about two balance sheets, to say, how do you know one is bad? I think the simple answer, because there's no simple answer to that, I guess the balance sheet is as strong as the strategy that it's supposed to give rise to. Yeah. But definitely a balance sheet that's bankrupt is a bad one for any business. And bankruptcy, I mentioned the other time, it's when you've got your assets funded, when you've got more liabilities than what your assets show in your balance sheet. So that one is a bankrupt one, or an insolvent balance sheet. That we will say is a bad one. But in terms of comparing balance sheet like for like, it's a difficult thing to do, because as I've mentioned, business model plays a whole lot into how the balance sheet looks like. You might look at a balance sheet that has no taxes in them, but it's a taxi business, and you think it's a bad one, and yet that's an Uber balance sheet. So those are the cautions that they need. I guess the typical thing that we are trying to create with this series of conversations is that understand the financing, investment, and operating decisions that you make, and how do they then add up to the scoreboard, which is the balance sheet.
So what I'm hearing you say is that your balance sheet cannot be divorced from your value proposition.
No, it can't.
It's not just a snapshot, but it's a snapshot of how your value proposition is actually alive.
Yeah, so it's an accounting way of representing what your value proposition is. But I don't want people to do like for like, to say a balance sheet equals to this value proposition. And I'll make a typical example. So one of the things you would have in your business model are things like your networking capability, for example, or one-star performer that you have in your business. Those you won't necessarily reflect in your balance sheet, but your balance sheet will be a lag indicator of the impact that those networks and those people have in getting you to create that advantage. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It cannot be divorced, because on the value creation side, you're making a whole lot of decisions, and I've just simplified it for people to say you're making investment decisions, you're making financing decisions, you're making operating decisions. Ultimately, the scoreboard will tell you how that makes up. I guess the proof of the pudding is how well are you growing that balance sheet over time. Because those decisions, by the way, will change from day to day, month to month, year to year, depending on the context of the business and where the business is heading, and the strategies that are being employed at that time over that planning period.
Why don't you have a balance sheet? That's my question to you. 011-883-0702. Are you getting any value in the conversation that is beginning to help us understand why we need to have a balance sheet, right? Saki Kuzwayo on Twitter says, Aubrey, balance sheet is important to the business and investors. Equity tells you if the business is investable or not. And then to that same conversation, OMT Consulting or Business Clinic says, boss, is there really an easy way to see if my books are cooked without my business planning documents? I really want to hear your thoughts about that. 011-883-0702. Andisa Ramavhunga is my guest. He's Group Chief Advisor at Ntiyiso Consulting. We're talking about the balance sheet and some of the jargon that we are beginning to understand in this conversation. Let me check.
On 702.
Some interesting questions coming from our listeners on Twitter. Augustine says, Aubrey, can an NPO go ask for funding without any balance sheets since it's new or rather newly registered? And then the Lion says, does goodwill / reputation of the business go into the balance sheet? If so, how is it measured as we close?
Yeah. So the NPO one is, I think we'll need more context. It depends what the mandate of that NPO is and whether they're raising grant funding or not. But simplistically saying that they will be able to raise money without any track record, without any assets, the chances are quite highly unlikely, unless it's well seeded and it's got quite good supporters behind it who are willing to maybe stand surety to certain things. And it's selling a very strong mandate, possibly. But I mean, I guess the permutations are large, but it's an unlikely scenario unless it's seeded by donors. And this is what we're not talking about is donor funding. You can almost classify that as equity that's being injected into the business. Goodwill, yes, it's classified under assets. This is when you're getting into the murky world of valuations, right? Because if, for example, you buy a business, or as a business you invest in another business, but you overpay for that business, you then look at that surplus. If you cannot justify that with any assets or formal way, accounting way, whether cash flows or whatever value you put into it, you then classify it as goodwill. And there's a number of those type asset classes, things like brands, you can put it in the IP as well to a certain extent, you can put them in there. But those are quite complicated ways, and you might need experts to value. And by the way, the brands, I would even argue, you need to have been in the market in a proven and tried and tested way to come back and value it in your balance sheet. But it's complicated. But you need obviously experts to value what that brand equity is equal to.
As we close, I think what I take away from our conversation tonight is that if we want to break out of the mold that keeps us in the label small business, then we've got to give our businesses an identity accounting-wise.
Yeah.
And that is a cogent balance sheet.
Yeah.
And that is going to allow us to enter into financing spaces that we could not have entered to if we didn't have the balance sheet.
Yes.
Would that be correct?
That's very correct. But to underscore the message, I guess, that we are trying to, it's always this linkage between value creation and balance sheet. Yeah. You need to be able to tell that story in a very succinct way and showing that linkages. So that people don't also misunderstand the balance sheet, because the absence of something might be a worry to someone, but it might be a competitive advantage to you strategic-wise.
Andisa Ramavhunga, Group Chief Advisor at Ntiyiso Consulting. How do we get in touch with you?
I can be reached on info@ntiyisoconsulting.co.za.
Much appreciated.